elders, men and women of the Ngunnawal people, who've never ceded this land and of which they remain the custodians. And I acknowledge the terrible injustices to which those who worked in this building and those who elected them subjected them. I should say here that I have Parkinson's, and one of the common symptoms of Parkinson's is what I call emotional incontinence. So if I break down and cry, I can't control it, so just wait and I'll get over it. Let me also acknowledge Catherine Dovey, whom I didn't see before. Yes, and it's a great pleasure to have you here. I have this vivid memory of you when Whitlam had an appointment with the King and Queen of Belgium, and you turned up at the palace with a simple dress and a belt, and the belt was made out of juicy fruit packets. I don't know whether you have that memory too, but... And I'd also like to acknowledge Louise Lake. As probably most of you know, Louise worked with me throughout the Whitlam years. She was always in the office, always trying to keep me in line and up to the work and everything else. So Louise, it's a delight to see you here. Okay, good morning, comrades. Politics, yes. Politics is about ideas and imagination. Together they can create and change the world. The gift that the Honourable E.G. Whitlam gave to us was the understanding that political change can't be piecemeal. It cannot be reduced to a list of standalone policies. That's a lesson that's lost, I think. It's important... Lasting political change, genuine social reforms, come about when they're based on principles and ideas, for it is these that make them coherent, all their constituent parts. It's important that we retrieve and rethink our heritage of social reforms, both as a political project and as a task for thinking politically in complex ways. Marion Saw, in her more recent writing, has stressed the importance of ideas in thinking politically. She argues that ideas are important in shaping and informing an institution, an institutional order, and a policy agenda. For these ideas to reflect a democratic process rather than an imposition, they must be communicated, clarified, and argued in public. The public engagement that this involves develops the culture and the institutional domains of public engagement and inquiry. It also shapes and informs the way we live with each other. These ideas must be explained and argued for if they are to constitute political ideologies, and to provide ethical choices about how to order and institutionalise human policy. These were the ideas and aspirations of the Australian Labor Party, as honed, polished and perfected by years of discussion and debate within and without the party. Whitlam's approach was based on a philosophical framework, a thorough policy design, fidelity to his agenda, courage in his convictions, and a deep belief in the ability of the electorate to think things through. His philosophical framework encompassed these ideas. Now, the interesting thing is that these ideas have slipped totally from our vocab. We just don't use them anymore. And I want to, they're not in common usage. Let us look a little more closely at them to remind ourselves of what the public discourse was like in those years. Now, Whitlam consistently and proudly described his government as a social democratic government. He believed that the decisive electoral support that he received, for example, in his address to the UN General Assembly on the 30th of September 1974, Whitlam began with these words: as head of Australia's first social democratic government since Australia helped to found the UN and to frame its charter, I reaffirm our loyalty to both. His program reflected genuinely social democratic values, the redressing of economic and social inequalities, the creation of new democratically participatory decision-making structures, the conferring of new civil liberties protection, and the redistribution of access, income and wealth. Whitlam succeeded in shifting the debate about poverty and inequality from a framing in terms of charity to one centred on broader concepts of social justice and citizenship. Poverty became a political issue that could be measured and addressed through social reforms for the first time. Positive equality, it's a phrase we just don't hear. When asked in 1973 in an interview, how would you like the Whitlam years to be remembered, Whitlam replied immediately that people from any regional background in Australia had equal opportunity. This is a brief statement, his philosophy of positive equality, in which he argues that a person's quality of life depends less and less on the things which individuals obtain for themselves and can purchase for themselves from their personal incomes, and depends more and more on the things which the community provides for all its members from the combined resources of the community. So, Pace Ayn Rand. This then was the philosophical basis for his belief that it was the role of governments to create the social goods that people could not create for themselves. A more independent Australia internationally? When he was sworn in as Prime Minister in December 1972, Whitlam said of his newly elected government, "Our thinking is towards a more independent Australian stance in international affairs and towards an Australia which will be less militarily oriented and not open to suggestions of racism. An Australia which will enjoy a growing standing as a distinctive, tolerant, cooperative and well-regarded nation." The Whitlam years saw a vast increased impact of international law, including human rights law, on domestic treaty law and policies. Whitlam deeply believed in the UN, and he committed Australia to ratify as many of the UN treaties as he possibly could. He also believed in taking stances beyond the UN in the Commonwealth, and hence we led in the imposition of sanctions on South Africa through the Commonwealth. And through the non-aligned movement, Whitlam seriously proposed to a number of non-aligned countries that Australia should be at least an observer at non-aligned meetings, because we had such an overlap of interests. And of course, the ANZUS Pact eventually precluded this. An enabling state to achieve social justice through social reforms. So Whitlam's philosophy of social democracy committed him to the regulation of the economy by the state to ensure the common good and to a welfare state offering social support to those in need. For example, equal rights to education, health, service, employment, pensions and sewerage. An enabling state was needed to counterbalance traditional market inequalities and to ensure access of all, regardless of class, gender, ethnicity, etc., to basic goods and services. Now, all these ways of talking and more resonated with the popular discourse here in Australia concerning fairness, wealth distribution, equality of opportunity, and community. Now, Whitlam's commitment to these ideas provided Whitlam with a set of working principles, which I've roughly characterised as the principle of equity, fairness and justice, the principle of what you could call citizenship, but which we'll call enfranchisement, as a precondition for social justice, and the principle of redistribution of services, opportunities, benefits, wages, security and wealth. Any proposal for policy development or advocacy if argued in terms of these principles, would be listened to, at least on a good day. And you didn't go near him on a bad day. All of the policy and programs supported by his government were to be in line with these principles. And to ensure this, he establishes a long-forgotten think tank called the Priorities Review Staff within his department to propose policies in line with these principles and to review all proposed policies to ensure that they reflected these principles. It was also tasked with ensuring the Fabian ideal of that research was the basis of policy. Whitlam attached overriding importance to research and insisted that policies should be justified in depth with facts. So they were the working principles that I encountered when I joined Whitlam's staff. But we have another set of ideas that's worth exploring. We have the ideas of the women's liberation movement, which equally fed in to this process that occurred in 73 to 75. Now, you'll see in a minute that I have a long, long list of topics that were discussed actively in the Canberra Women's Liberation group meetings every week we had. So I've classified them roughly because there's too many of them as thinking politically, socialism and feminism, sexuality and its constraints, women at work and decriminalising women. Okay, and then the women's group also, so we not only had discussion groups, but we had action groups. So we were oriented around that. So, for example, that's one of the posters for an International Women's Day meeting, and you can see our demands: the right to work, equal pay, one rate for the job, equal opportunity for work, education and free childcare, safe contraception, safe legal abortion on request, and smash the draft criminal code for the Australian territories. And another one. So there were, I mean, this was an intellectually very, very torrid almost time. And if you think this was unique to Canberra, have a look at Sydney. That's just volume 1, less 1. That's all of volume 1 with one exception, number 9 is not there, of the Sydney Me Jane, who were as active as we were, as was Brisbane, and as was everywhere else. So there was a huge intellectual ferment that was going on at that time. And then in January 1973, there was a feminist theory conference that's held in Mount Beauty, and that is the agenda there. So this was our language, and these were our concerns. Now, 1973 to 1975, when Harry met Sally, when social democracy met feminism, Marion Saw points out that the early 70s was an unusually favourable time for new social movements and their policy engagement. In April 1973, I was appointed Special Advisor to the Prime Minister on matters relating to women and children. For the next 2.5 years, the women's movement operated, at least in part, through the state to achieve feminist social reforms in the funding of feminist services. Let me highlight just a few of the policies that this conjunction of the Whitlam principles and the feminist agenda produced and from which women benefited. So I'm not going to, I won't need to expand on these, and thereby I can save a lot of time, because a number of them have already been discussed, and I'm sure more will be discussed. This is only some. Don't forget that I argued the need for coherent policies, and you can't pluck one out and highlight it. These are all interrelated, but they're some of the more dramatic ones. Now, I'm just going to quickly go through some of these because I want to make 1 or 2 points. The supporting mother's benefit. Now, this was payable to any woman with the sole custody and care of a child. And so for the first time, women, including unmarried women, were able to choose to keep their children and not have to give them up for adoption. In fact, in 1974, some 26,000 women received the benefit, of whom 14,000 were unmarried. This measure gave to these women a sense of agency, self-esteem and financial independence. And it also contributed significantly to the demise of the adoption industry in Australia. Free tertiary education, that's been discussed, and I think we all know from lived experience in our family stories how important that was for women. Universal minimum income. Now, this is really interesting. It was from the Priorities Review staff that I first heard of a guaranteed universal minimum income, now known as a citizen's basic income. This benefit explicitly incorporates the notion that income should be derived from rights of citizenship. Such an approach to policy provides for an account of the different social experiences of men and women in a market-based economy. It therefore has the potential to promote more gender equitable outcomes. This was an idea that there was not time to explain or to argue for, and so it did not enter into the panoply of ideas that Whitlam introduced, into the Australian polity. However, without Whitlam, we wouldn't even have had universal health care, which of course is linked to this. Okay, let's go on. Equal pay services for women childcare. I think they're adequately covered. So I'll just now go on to the Family Law Act, and I do that, I'm just going to pause briefly here, because that was, Michael Kirby has described the Family Law Act of 1975 as perhaps the most pervading reform of the private law effected during the Whitlam administration. And the Royal Commission into Human Relationships. The Royal Commission on Human Relationships was established with powers to inquire into a wide range of factors which could affect interpersonal relationships, including sexuality and social constraints, rape within and outside of marriage, termination of pregnancies, family planning, fertility control, childbirth and sex and the relationship education. Such a Royal Commission remains unique in the world, and we were fortunate to have with us here today its chairperson, Justice Elizabeth Reid. Yes. Other commissioners were Anne Davidson and Archbishop Felix Arnott. And Devison. Yes, my apologies. That's right. Whitlam said of the commissioners that they were pioneers not only in Australia but in the world in the humane and rational examination and consideration of the matters entrusted to them. Our community and all the families and individuals in it benefited from its work. Good. So, a more independent Australia internationally. We feminists entered the governmental arena in order to bring to bear the resources of the state to the concerns of women. The speech that the Prime Minister made at the inaugural meeting of the National Advisory Committee for International Women's Year acknowledged the central tenet of the Feminist Manifesto, one which coincided completely with Whitlam's own manifesto, namely the essential role of an enabling state in social reform and welfare. Yet, whilst acknowledging the centrality of the state in addressing issues of concern to women, the speech goes on to acknowledge that, I quote, "Government legislation can only achieve so much, and I shall not pretend to you that any government can achieve immediately for Australian women the revolution required to allow them to develop fully." This recognition that both reform and revolution are necessary to bring about the changes women needed. This is a recognition. To achieve this, the speech continues, is a matter of changing community attitudes and uprooting community prejudices. Thus, central to this feminist framework for action was the need for radical change, indeed a revolution, in attitudes about women within society and within women themselves. Addressing sexism through attitudinal change in Australian society was to be at the core of the programme for International Women's Year. It was also to be Australia's contribution to the First World Conference for Women, held in Mexico City in 1975. Penny Wensley, Sarah Dowse and Susan Ryan are all here today and were outspoken members of Australia's outstanding delegation. In his speech at the opening of the Women in Politics Conference in August 1975, Whitlam spoke of the feminist concept of the personal as political, and so brought this feminist insight into the traditional concept of the political. I quote, "Women are insisting more and more that concerns of the home be the concerns of politics and, that the personal be political. Childcare, family planning, housework, and so on are now becoming issues for the political arena. To this extent, women are in the process of trying to redefine and redescribe the political." Whitlam was at ease with the feminist framework and discourse and comfortable in using it. In the Whitlam years, Whitlam, reflecting on his achievement, says, "Yet even the fullest account of what is achieved will not tell the whole story, for I always saw a principal part of my task as being to place issues on the national agenda. I accepted this role throughout my parliamentary career. The terms and substance of the national debate were transformed. The Whitlam Government gave new meaning to the principles of democratic socialism in its passionate pursuit of the values of equality, democracy, liberty, and social cooperation. The attainment of each of these values involved fundamental changes in our social organisation and a way of doing things. Feminism brought new insights into the polity, that the person is political, the policies are not gender neutral given the different locations of men and women in the division of labour, and so on. Without the influence of feminism, social democracy in Australia would have been a much diminished movement. As late as 1973, Whitlam was acknowledging that the ALP was, I quote, "a male-dominated party in a male-dominated parliament in a male-dominated society." The feminist agenda, framed in terms of reform and revolution, of patriarchy and sexism, of agency and voice, and of the common good, caused significant discursive shifts, traces of which hopefully lurk in today's shadows. Thank you.